Hi, everyone, and welcome to the State of Business Operations webinar. Um, my name is Brett Lee. I'm the VP of Product Marketing at Tonkin, and I have the pleasure of being joined by Professor Terri Griffith, who is the Beedie Chair in Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Fraser University Beedie School of Business. Excited to be here today and chat with everybody about BizOps. So just to get started, a little bit more about myself. So I lead product marketing for a company called Tonkin. We are a cross-functional business operations platform to help people streamline their processes using no-code process orchestration. And we have worked with a number of different enterprises from mid-size to large Fortune hundreds. I personally have been in the B2B technology space for over 10 years and excited here to see the progress that's being made and the focus being put on business operations, and excited to share the findings of this report to everyone today. And Terri, would you give a little bit of background about yourself to everyone?
Happy to. Thank you everyone for joining us. As we heard, I'm the Beedie Chair in Innovation and Entrepreneurship at Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada. Although I spent the last 20 years in the Silicon Valley, and I focus on how people come to understand and use new technologies in their workplace. So I'm thrilled to be getting an early peek at this data and having the chance to think with all of you about how this will drive our futures.
Great. Thanks for joining us today, Terri, and looking forward to the conversation. So we're here today to talk about and analyze the results of the State of Business Operations report that we performed at the end of last year. Quite interesting and exciting findings about what's happening in business operations. So why did we do a survey to begin with? I think what we found in business operations is that the role of operations is becoming more and more critical in every function, from legal to sales to IT to marketing, etc. More and more people are putting an emphasis on people, process, and technology, and how to combine those together to maximize efficiency and outcomes for each of the divisions. And that's quite exciting. Also, the pace of change is, as always, rapidly increasing, but especially post-COVID. I think the disruption to how businesses operate seemingly overnight is putting a lot of pressure on operations teams to be able to adapt and to overcome the challenges that are in front of all of us right now. And then finally, what's exciting is there's a lot of new technology in the space, no code, AI, ML, automation, that's giving business operations more and more power to be able to drive efficiency. So we wanted to find out what was happening in the space and what people were seeing. And so the survey itself, we surveyed 500 IT and business operations professionals, and it was interesting to see the mix of IT and BizOps. It was, quite, it was a 50-50 split between the two groups of people. And business operations as a practice crosses over, both the technology side of the business as well as the business teams themselves. And so it was interesting to see the different perspectives that teams had. Also, very much the survey was focused on the enterprise. We had about 60% of respondents come from companies that were 500 to 2,000 employees, and 40% that were over 2,000 employees. So skewed towards larger companies, larger enterprises, where I think, and not to say that operations is not important even in companies that are smaller, but I think the challenges, complexity, and importance of operations becomes more and more increasingly so in larger companies. And then finally, we did the survey actually post-COVID. So some of the responses were impacted, I think, by the changes that we see in the macroeconomics. So I wanted to start off, we want to start off by sharing some of the key findings that we had in the survey. And then we'll go deeper and talk about some of the topics and trends that we see and how to maybe apply some best practices, some frameworks that come from Terri's research on how you can think about and overcome some of these challenges and the findings that we had. So first, as I talked about, business operations becoming more crucial. We saw that about 95% of the survey respondents agree, and this is across IT and business operations, that business operations is becoming more important in their organizations. So that's quite an exciting number. I think, again, it reinforces the fact that more and more companies are putting a focus on how they operate. But also with that criticality and with that importance also comes more and more needs. On the flip side, only 24% of survey respondents believes that the current tool sets satisfy all of their operational challenges. And so there's quite a bit to go in delivering and equipping business operations teams, as well as IT, with the tools that they need to satisfy all of their requirements. And operations is also, as I mentioned before, growing across all functions. So this is not just a central biz ops team supporting the business. You see operations teams in sales, in customer success, in legal, in finance. These operations teams are growing in every single function because they need that domain expertise within those functions to be able to apply the practice of operational efficiency to that. But also we see commonalities, across all functions. Frequently you think legal and sales, the operations are going to be completely different, but a lot of the challenges, the best practices, the thinking can be actually translated across these different departments as well. And as I mentioned before, there was a breakdown in IT and operations, and it was a bit surprising, but also good to see that both IT, not just the business operations teams themselves, but IT also saw the importance in focusing on process efficiency, and that was good to see. And then finally, the technology investment has also been increasing post-COVID. So there has been even more heightened focus on operations. Once all of us had to work from home, there was stress put on businesses. 87% of survey respondents said that automation is becoming more important. So people are looking at technology as a way to fill in some of the gaps that were kind of being held together by people and by the osmosis of people being in an office, right? And some of the processes that were happening that way. And also you see technology budgets increasing. 54% of technology budgets are increasing post-COVID. So people are putting money behind this as well. Now, the second thing that we noticed is business operations still lack the necessary resources for them to be successful. And we surveyed the biggest barriers to improving some of these processes. And here's the top 5 that we saw, and people could select multiple ones. The common one that you would expect, limited budget. People always need more money to be able to solve challenges. But surprisingly, 56% mentioned change management. And that, based on our experience, hasn't necessarily been at the forefront of what people thought about. And so I think it was surprising to see this. 51% said lack of time, 49% said access to IT and engineering, which is, I think, a common challenge. And then finally, 47% said lack of tools. I know, Terri, you do a lot of research in this area of operations, and you also have a focus on change management as well. So maybe you can comment a little bit about some of these findings.
Absolutely. And the change management angle, I'm very happy to see it getting that score. And I'll share that some of our research will also say if you dig a little deeper into the change management piece, you can say to people, well, what are the underlying components of change management that are really important to your success? And most leaders will say people. And yet, when I look at that budget number, when I ask them, you said people, please show me your budget for taking on this new approach, this new technology. The people component, so things that might be training time, the ability to make errors and building that into your time roadmap, those aren't there. And so I'll say limited budget is probably an underestimate because I expect that those budgets don't include enough of the people components to that change management. So we know that there needs to be effort towards change management, but sometimes because the people aspects are fuzzier, and so they're harder to put into that budget. So if I'm buying a piece of technology, I know what that's going to cost me. I can talk about the lifetime cost of that approach. But it's harder for people to do those estimates when it comes to the human side of things. And so not only is limited budget an issue, but I think it's actually an underestimate. And we really have to make sure that we're building in effective change management. And I would even think of it as kind of a figurative negotiation. So knowing who that broader set of stakeholders are, as well as being able to implement the different components of that change.
Yeah.
Great. We're at least acknowledging this importance, though.
That's actually a great point, because one of the things we always talk about with our clients is kind of total cost of ownership. And people, I think, tend to underestimate the cost of new software, for example. It's like, it's not just the license cost. It's also, what does it cost to get people adopting the software, training and implementing the software, maintaining the software, right? And so those are things, to your point about the human side of technology, that people tend to underestimate. And I think there is a movement towards putting more focus on that piece of it. It's not just the licensing cost, it's how do we make it more efficient, more maintainable, less complex, over time. And I think that's quite critical. So great point. Also, you see that the access to developers vary from ops to IT. And I think that creates some differences of opinion that you'll start to see between the operations teams and IT. Kind of to be expected, right? Most IT teams have developers on their team, whereas business operations have less access. They tend to rely more on external dev teams, maybe in IT, or consultants elsewhere. And that variation in access to development creates a different approach also to how people solve operational challenges with software, right, with technology. IT tends to prefer building applications. About 47% of the respondents in IT said we mostly build solutions for business challenges. Whereas on the operations side, their majority, or not, I shouldn't say majority, but more leaning towards buying solutions packaged off the shelf. And that's a direct correlation to the access to developers, right? But that also leads to a different view on apps. I think most of us would agree that there's too many apps in every business that we're in, right? It's too complex, not only for IT and ops to manage, but also for end users to use. We're jumping between different apps all day. However, that view is pretty extreme in IT. If you look at this kind of donut chart here, about 82% of IT respondents agreed to the fact that there are too many software apps being used in the business. And I think that is an indication that they're most of the times on the hook for maintaining these applications. They're not the ones always that chooses these applications. There is, shadow IT and people on the business choosing their own apps. And so they feel kind of the pain and the brunt of that. But on the ops side, they're trying to get things done, right? And they have limited resources to do so. So while they do majority agree, about 51% agree that there's too many apps, there's also about 28.7%, 29%, 30% of the folks that actually disagreed that there's too many apps. They think there needs to be more apps because there's likely gaps in their processes that still haven't yet been filled by technology. That's still manual, right? So it was interesting to see the difference of opinion between IT and operations. So third is then, okay, we've seen some of the trends of business operations becoming more important. There's more needs, there are challenges. Now, how are some opportunities around technology helping to fill some of those gaps and bridge the gap of some of those differences between IT and the business? And we asked a series of questions about low code and no code and automation because it's a growing trend in business operations and technology that increasingly organizations are looking at to solve some of these challenges. This was perhaps the most surprising number that we had in the entire survey, we thought that no code and low code solutions were kind of early in adoption, that people were just starting to look at it, just starting to adopt it. But 95% of the survey respondents said they had either already adopted or are about to, actively contemplating no code and low code solutions. And so overwhelmingly, I think both IT and business operations are looking to expand the capabilities within the organization and create more flexibility to deliver software solutions without having to write custom code or buy a bunch of apps, right? And what we also saw is that most believe in the promise of no code, low code, right? About 70% of the survey respondents believe that no-code solutions would empower business operations teams to get more work done without engineering resources. However, with that said, there were still about 10% of the pie that were not familiar with these tools. And I think that is indicative of no-code, low-code still being somewhat early. I think most people don't exactly know what no-code, low-code is, don't know what tools are available, have some kind of reservations from the IT side, thinking, well, if I give more capabilities to the business, are they actually going to be able to deliver on something that is maintainable, that can handle complex business processes, that's not going to have errors? Whereas on the other side in business, it's like, do I trust that I can do this without IT help? Do I end up having to go back to IT anyways, right? So there are a lot of still concerns around no code, low code, and automation that is still developing within the organization. So a couple of things to kind of highlight, and transitioning a little bit into having a conversation about best practices and what we can take away and learn and from this study. To define a little bit about no code and low code, at a high level, it's basically any platform or any software that allows non-developers to build software, right? Pretty basic to understand. However, there's a lot of nuances in the difference of the space. First is there is a spectrum, and it's really a sliding scale between development, low code, and no code. Frequently, I think what you'll see in the market is low code and no code being kind of used in conjunction, almost as synonyms with each other. However, it's quite a bit different. For most business operations teams, right, on the business side, any type of code is going to put that tool outside of the realm of them being able to adopt it. And so for the most part, low code tools are being used by IT, by developers, to speed up the pace at which they can actually create software, right? So it's not actually targeted towards expanding who can write software. It's more for acceleration. Whereas no code is truly about putting more citizen development capabilities in the hands of the business, right? On the other side, you have differences between app development and process orchestration. So you can apply no code, low code concepts to different types of outcomes. One is it's about building apps. And a lot of cases, this is actually where no code kind of started, right? No code started off in kind of the consumer arena where people could use sites like Wix and WordPress and others to build websites, build a wedding website themselves, without having to hire a developer to go do that. And that's starting to make its way into the enterprise, where you have solutions that help people build software using drag and drop methods without having to write code. But you could also apply no code, low code to things around automation and orchestration, if you will. How do you take a business process and break it apart into its individual actions and have those actions take place on top of the existing tool set? So there's also varying types of technologies that are allowing you to do those two types of different things. So that's just a little bit about the technology. So ultimately what we want is to have, knowing kind of what we know about the importance of business operations, about how it's growing, about thinking about technology, but also thinking about the process themselves, thinking about organizational structure. What are some of the frameworks or ideas that can help you improve your business operations today? So with that, I'm going to start the topic of talking about thinking in 5 T's. And this is, I know, a topic, an idea that Terri, you championed and pioneered. So I'll let you kind of explain a little bit of what this is, but then also apply it to some of the things that we've been talking about.
Absolutely. Thank you for the chance. And what I've really got going here is a diagram that shows how interconnected all these things are. So it's not a binary choice of no code, low code, or developer driven versus no code. It's something that has to completely come together in your organization's setting. And these ideas have been around in sort of the business school world since the technology we were talking about were mining machines. But it's even more important today because technology is touching every aspect of our organizations. And so no surprise, we're always going to start out with a target. We need to know what we're trying to do. What is it? What operations are we trying to make be better, faster, less error prone? Once we know that, then what we have to try and do is align across talent, technology, and technique while thinking clearly about the times that we're doing this in. So you could be saying, well, it's a COVID times, we have a lot of work from home happening, or I'm in a business that is incredibly security focused, maybe financial settings. So that context component. So I've got to know my target. I have to understand what are the capabilities. So this would be where I'm talking about how many people do I have that actually have development expertise versus folks who have great business operations expertise, but not the development capabilities. What technologies are going to function effectively in our organization? And then the techniques. And techniques in this case could both be what process are we talking about, but also what governance structures do we have in place in our organization that can serve as guardrails and then let people do more themselves within those guardrails. So another image, if you wanted to think about what's the counter to thinking in 5T, it's sort of a silver bullet approach. So if someone says, well, if we just hired this one person who could be the champion for automation, well, that's going to solve all my problems. Or if we just implemented this particular technology platform, then everything else will just work itself out. And that's not true. These things are really tied together. And let me see if I can get my prop up here and show it effectively. So, it's not even just a 5-pointed star. It's something much more complex. And I like to say to people, if you tried to just pull on one of these knobs, and you pulled hard enough, you tried to change just one thing, a silver bullet approach, that's not going to work. It's going to break. Instead, what you should be expecting is if I'm trying to bring more automation into my business operations environment, I'm going to have to move other things as well. And that might be training, it might be a technology change. But as I set that target, I have to think about a more systematic approach and what the other dimensions are going to be that I need to touch. So that's both operational and work design. And you have to enable that flexibility. So, if you're trying to remember this after you leave this webinar, say something like, we see in 3D, we need to think in 5T. And then target, talent, technology, and technique aligned for your particular times. And I'm always looking forward to hearing what Brett has to say about things like this. So,
yeah, absolutely. No, I love the analogy as we see Jesse chat, and I think the dependency is exactly what people tend to not think about enough at the beginning, right? They think they have this one singular problem and they find a point solution to solve this problem, and they're done. It's not ever like that because it's not just the overhead and the constant maintenance of that particular solution, but it's also the dependencies that it has on everything else. And one example I like to, going back to no code, low code, is that in and of itself is a technology enabler, right, if you will. Mm-hmm. But that has immense impact on the other 4 parts of this, right? You think about talent. Now, perhaps you can have somebody who used to be just handling processes, now building solutions that automates those processes. So it actually up levels their skill sets and up levels what they can do, right? it changes the technique of how you approach things, right? Not everything needs to be yet another point solution, and maybe you can turn things that used to be manual into something a bit more efficient, right? And changing that technique. And then even so, you can also think about changing the target. And I think that's actually quite interesting because people don't think about the acceleration that the democratization of technology provides. If more people could build software, right? If more people could find inefficiencies and fill them, then you could increase the targets of what the outcomes is for your organization. And so I think it's extremely powerful, this concept of the dependency, but how one ingredient put in the right place can have a impact on everything else in the star. Cool. So actually, I'm seeing questions come in, and maybe since we're on here, we can pause for them. So a question for you, Terri. What are some other significant moves you're seeing from your research of the enterprise? And this is from Max Chen's.
Okay, well, I'll give it a go. And Max, if you want to dive a little deeper in your question, I'll be happy to direct my questions more effectively. The kinds of moves I'm seeing are, and we'll get to this in a future slide, is this bottom-up approach and then pushback sometimes against a bottom-up approach. But when Brett said the democratization of technology giving us more power, that is absolutely foundational, I think, to our futures of work. And I always make that future plural because who knows what the future will bring, and there could be multiple futures, and depending on the kind of organization you're in. So for example, if we think about before personal computers and after personal computers, before personal computers, it was a very top-down thing about how we used our computing resources, and developers focused on what those mainframes would do for us. When personal computers came along, everyone could write something, or I shouldn't say everyone, many more people could certainly come into the world and do things with that computing power. Maybe it was, sorting out their recipes or handling their checkbook. And we saw the explosion that becomes the internet. But we couldn't have done that if we didn't have personal computers, if we didn't have more accessible technology that reduced the requirements on the talent side and then opened up all the different techniques that people could apply. So I'm seeing that. I'm also seeing an appreciation of flexibility around organizational design. And if you want to go to kind of an extreme version of it, you could think about gig work organizations, and that we're not only being more flexible inside our organizations, but we're also being more flexible about how we build them and who gets to participate. So I can have organizations where people are coming and going. I work with an organization called Hyperloop Transportation Technologies, and it starts out entirely crowd-based because we had the technology to be able to leverage a broader set of talent in a variety of very interesting techniques. So I think as we start to talk about this bottom-up, top-down, you can also think about kind of and wider as well. So I hope that was going along in the direction that you were wanting, and if not, just put up another question.
Yeah, absolutely. And going back to your there's multiple futures concept, I think, not to get a bit philosophical, but I think there's this overarching narrative that automation and the prevalence of automation is going to move the world in a certain way, right? Basically replacing people, replacing the jobs that people do, and et cetera. But rather, I feel like we have control over what that future state looks like. If we apply automation in the right places, and if we don't replace people in the right places because people have unique skill sets, then you get to a place where automation is playing the right role and is actually complementing people, not replacing people, right? And I think operations teams and business operations in general have a huge role to play in that, because they're actually on the front lines of deciding where technology should be applied, what tasks you want a machine to do and what tasks or software to do, and what tasks people should be doing, right? And I think that's an important thing to think about is that power to wield, where to apply technology in the right places. Cool. So the next thing as well, you mentioned, Terri, bottom up versus kind of top down approaches. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. So if we think about top down, I'm going to claim that our technology leadership are doing a pretty decent job. They're scanning the environment, they're learning about the new technologies that are available, they're talking with their business operations people about the kinds of things they need to do, and they're doing that in focused ways. But you'll notice that's a pyramid, and so what happens at the top has to be more narrow than all the possibilities at the bottom. And so what I'm thinking a lot about is how do we all apply automation to our work? And again, one of the things our research suggests is it doesn't happen all that much that someone takes what I call a stop, look, listen moment and really thinks about how might I automate my work? And this is entirely on a personal job perspective, but if you aren't thinking about how to add automation to your own work, someone else is, and that may not be the way you want it to play out. So I certainly do like to think about automation as augmenting my capabilities. They'll talk about being able to shift our individual thinking to those higher order, more human capabilities or needs, and then letting the technology do the more rudimentary, repetitive work. Absolutely. But the true value of that bottom-up component is that you get so many more people thinking about the things that could be done versus just what can be done for the benefit of the organization. And that, by necessity, has to be a narrower set of things. Governance, Brett, you're going to talk far better about governance than I am. I think of governance as guardrails rather than limiting rules. So you have the guardrails, but then you kind of let as much as possible then be flexible within those guardrails.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, my thoughts about this is that you do need both. You need bottom up and you need top down, and you need them to be well connected together, right? Because the power of bottom up automation and having, the democratization of technology, if you will, is that you get innovation at a much faster pace than if you siloed technology enablement to smaller teams, right? However, that can also be dangerous, right? If you think about it from a governance perspective, people can break things. If they're not used to following development best practices, they may not know why, they may launch something before it's quite ready, and that'll break something and have impact in the business. You get security issues and things like that, right? Also, by the way, if you have too much bottom-up automation without governance, people might be choosing different tools, and you have even yet more complexity in the enterprise. So that's why you need to marry the bottom-up automation with a top-down approach of creating that governance structure, right? But I would say it's more than just governance. It's actually empowerment. If you can think about how do you allow IT to create empowerment to the business, enable more bottom-up automation in those guardrails, in that framework, and maybe fill in some of the gaps that business teams have from a technology standpoint, that's even more powerful, right? And so I see a question on the right here saying, is there a right or wrong approach? I don't think there's a right or wrong approach. The right approach actually is you should take both approaches, and you need to find the right balance and the right connection points between those approaches.
Yeah, and Brett, I'm going to continue on a little bit. I was looking at Donald's question. I know I need some governance, but I'm also going to think, more broadly. I get my little baby toy out again here. Not only the governance components, but I need to be thinking about, do I need to offer preparation for the people in my organization? Do I need to help them on the talent side? Governance might be on the technique side. And then I guess the right answer is something that is thoughtful and multidimensional and appropriate for your times and your target. That's the way I would define right or wrong. And I guess that's why I was willing to come down on, I know something's wrong if it's not also speaking to the governance issues in an organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So a little bit about kind kind of the holistic thinking that's involved here. I know this is a chart that you created in a recent study about kind of this balance of technology and technique. Can you tell more about this?
Absolutely. So I've had the opportunity to do small workshops since, I want to say, May, since starting in May. So people were deeply into work from home challenges for the most part. And I was able to ask them to think back to, Q4 of 2019, when we weren't thinking about all that could come in the future. Think about what happened right there at the middle of March. And then depending on the time of the workshop, I would say, and what have you been doing in the last 2 weeks? Right. So that could be, very different in terms of when the 2 weeks was, but always asking the person think about the last 2 weeks in your own work. And I asked them about how many changes they had made to how they go about doing their work. So their crafting of their own work. And that's kind of a semi-permanent adjustment that they make to their approach to their work. And I always say work rather than job, because someone could be in a freelance kind of scenario. And then how they put that in place. So semi-permanent, something that has to do with how they go about doing their work, and then not directed by the organization. So if your organization said you're going to use Zoom, that wouldn't fit into this. But if you were figuring out how you were going to do your own work and you were applying some new automation, a new tool, a new approach, that would fit my definition. So as I asked them those questions, you see not so many changes in, thinking back to the before times, an average of 2.5 technology changes in that quarter, little over 3 in that quarter. But certainly we hit the crisis and people know they have to make some changes. And so it jumps way up. But even though we're still in what I would say is a very different, very dynamic environment for doing individual work, we're falling back down to some sort of stability. And I wonder if that actually makes sense. If we shouldn't always be thinking about making small adjustments to our work. The other thing that I look at this, and I can tell you in terms of statistical significance, the one at the crisis point, those two are not different, is that technique always, in every workshop I do, people are saying they're making more changes to their techniques than they are to their technology tools. And that shocked me, because as I think about technology, that's something, again, that I can define, I can look at, people are trying to sell to me. And so the fact that those numbers always report lower is a little bit concerning. I hope that they're thinking about and balancing out both at the same time. Of course, I don't want to have a single silver bullet, right? But the idea that people focus on techniques, and this is general population. So in general, people are focusing on techniques and not perhaps looking at all the powerful tools that really could be supporting them in our work. And we see that when the World Economic Forum says we need to reskill, we need to upskill. Almost always first dimension is there is the kind of technological savvy that people have. So that was kind of interesting data to me.
Yeah, and to ask a follow-on to that, do you think it's because there's too much technology out there that sometimes it's hard to know what technology can be applied? Like what do you think, how do you overcome some of the gaps in people being aware of what technology is available to solve some of their operational challenges or day-to-day work challenges in this case, right?
Yeah, and if I think about the broad organization, I even think about your word cloud chart, the folks who have those technical skill sets are probably in the majority of organizations in the minority, that the most of the organization is filled with people who are not IT specialists. And so it's going to fall more on those who have the technology savvy to help bring up the others, help them do that filtering. Yeah. And so maybe it is the case that people say, this is just far too much and I'm going to stick with what I know. or not. But it's an opportunity, I think, to really improve how organizations work and how our own work suits us better.
Yeah, and kind of connecting this to something that we see in operations is I think that is the role that a lot of operations team play, right? Because they're the ones that are close enough to the end users of that business, the business users, if you will, to be able to know and have enough knowledge of the technology and higher level view of the process to know how do you mix these things together. What I would encourage and what I see good operations teams doing is being closer and even closer to the end user, not just taking in feedback from top down, from like what are the business requirements, what are the executives need, but actually asking the question to the business users themselves, what would make your day more efficient? You know, what are you spending time on that you shouldn't be spending time on, right? If you think about in the sales context, salespeople don't want to be filling in data into the customer into the CRM, right? So how can you make those things easier so that you get the business need filled at the same time? And I think that's an important role that operations teams play. To bring this back to the COVID discussion, there was a question from Jesse about how have the way operations teams work changed permanently in the face of COVID-19. I'm curious to get your thoughts, Terri, but just very quickly, the things that we see is this movement towards how can I adapt faster? And I think that's an approach in thinking that's going to be permanently changed before COVID and after COVID. And examples of that is how do I rely less on rigid applications, and how do I create more flexibility in the way that we can solve business challenges, right? How do I find platforms that allow me to do this? How do I create more empowerment and enablement between IT and operations? How do I reduce the reliance on custom development? So those are all things that we're seeing. And I think it's because of COVID that there was a stress on the infrastructure of operations. And how do I now create a more flexible and adaptive way going forward of, the next time, a catastrophe like this happens, that we're ready for it.
Right. And, I'm always going to start with my 5 T's, and I'm going to say, if the target has stayed the same in terms of what our organization is striving to do and offer to the world, then has talent changed? I think we have a far greater appreciation of the richness our talent brings, right? You understand who has pets and doesn't have pets, how people are managing to be able to work with a family working in the same room with them. Yeah. So we know that. We also have seen a huge rise in people going out and learning things on their own. So upskilling themselves, either in free courses or paid courses. And even the universities are making adjustments on their technique and technology side, and that it was a great kick for us to start offering smaller bites of education. And I'll talk about a mosaic of education rather than 2 heartbeats and a flat line. So maybe I get an undergraduate degree and maybe I get a graduate degree and then I'm done. I don't want to see that. I want to see a mosaic of education. And we're seeing people do that for themselves post-COVID. Organizations then, and I'll answer Jesse's question about technique here as well, then need to adjust their policies and practices. Maybe what they do is they pay far more attention and in a shorter time cycle of checking in with people about what their skills are and what their interests are and what their aspirations within the organizations are, and then helping them craft their work in a way that is going to leverage the parts that they want to leverage. So the technique for me are policies, processes, the way we get around using what we know and the tools that we have and bringing those things together. And if that isn't enough, please just ask a follow-up on that one.
Great point. Great. And so as a kind of continuation of the topic that we're on, right, I think it's one of the things that is important is thinking about how do you build a foundation, and better yet, a foundation that can adapt, right, to empower people within the organization. And how do you do it combining top-down and bottom-up approaches. So I know this graph on the left is something that, Terri, that you put together. Can you talk the audience through kind of what this is showing and what it indicates?
I'll do that, and then I'll leave composable to you, at least as a starter.
Yeah.
So what we're seeing in that left graph is some research my colleagues and I have done over the course of years, where we're trying to understand, are there people in the world who really do take on this kind of a 5T approach? And then how are those folks different than people who aren't? And can we actually train or support people in coming to understand how to think in 5T more effectively? And I think the data is showing us that yes, you can teach it. And let me walk you through how I think about it. We give people a bunch of different scenarios, and these are pretty rich scenarios. So an organization is maybe coming into social media and they haven't been using that kind of a tool set in the prior times, and a particular individual goes off and does something. And so how does the organization respond? And in some cases, organizations have said, you better stop that right now. We don't have governance around that. You can't do it. Other organizations said, hey, do whatever you want. We'll just see how it all plays out. And then others take a more thoughtful 5T kind of approach that we can see. And so looking at 4 different groups of people, and I'll say low experience, what they end up doing when we ask them to choose what's the best response to this particular scenario, what's the best response, they have no idea. It's random as to which response they pick. If you have more experience, if you're in one of our workshops, if you're a very organizationally focused CIO, or people who we have identified, through their peers as being what I call a 5T guru, then you go, silver bullet answers to this question, that's a bad idea. I'm going to rank that really low. On the other hand, it's kind of in the middle as to whether you say, well, I'm just going to let it play out and I'll learn from it and we'll see what we do next. I tend to think that design thinking specialists might fit into that one. They want to see what happens and then make some adjustments. I won't get in too much about 5T versus dynamic 5T, but imagine a 5T version where you've thought through that star and you've also said, I'm going to think through that star. I'm going to maybe do some experiments. So I am kind of weaving in a design thinking approach there. And then I'll keep improving as I go. So it's a dynamic 5T. If I have been trained, so I'm in a 5T workshop, if I am a very organizationally focused CIO, or if I've been identified by my peers as someone who has kind of a 5T perspective in general, I'm going in that direction. And those differences between average, untrained, maybe lesser experienced folks is pretty dramatic. And what it says to me is we really have to help people if we do want to do bottom-up approaches to how we bring in automation, low code. We just can't throw it at them and say, figure it out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great analysis of the training that is required from an approach perspective, right? And kind of on the right, this idea of a composable enterprise is the empowerment from a technology perspective. So this is actually a trend that has been identified by the IT research firm, analyst firm Gartner, right? And the concept is such that instead of every solution, technology solution, kind of being its own silo or its own thing, right? If you will, standalone solution that solves one particular business problem, you want to think about creating components. And each of these components is something called a packaged business capability. It does some business outcome in and of itself, right? And the best way to enable the enterprise is for IT to create a number and a host of these different reusable components that then can be weaved together or composed together by the business. And I think it's a really, really powerful concept because that's how you get from I need something as a legal team, or I need something as a sales team, and I go to IT and I say, can you deliver this to me? And they deliver, and then you move on to the next thing, to a place where I have a toolkit of Lego blocks, if you will, right? And these Lego blocks I can piece together to build any flavor of different houses that I want to suit my own needs. Now, if I need a new Lego block, that's when I go back to IT and say, can you give me this new Lego block for me to use? Not only do you have the governance structure because IT is creating these Lego blocks and they're defining what flavor, it can be blue, but not red. It can only be green, etc. And it can only be this size and not much bigger. And then the business can put it together, but you get that enablement that you're looking for and the empowerment, right, on the business side. So I think it's a really, really powerful concept. There's a lot of technology now in place to allow this to happen. Things like APIs, things like no code, low code, right? But I think there is also a thinking of creating this technological architecture to allow this to happen at the enterprises. But I think that is empowerment. Okay, so the last concept and kind of a connection to this, and I'll take the lead, and Terri, feel free to chime in as well, is in practice, how do you make this happen, right? How do you actually connect IT with the business and map the top-down, bottom-up approaches and allow this empowerment to happen? Well, we have this concept in Tonkin about building a bridge, right, between business and IT. And this can be led by either side. Business can come in and say, I need to solve this particular, business problem. They go to IT and they say, well, instead of actually delivering this solution to me, can you create a set of components that allow me to build them myself, right? Or on the IT side, they could say, I want to standardize on an approach to how I solve business challenges going forward. And I actually want to equip more and more business teams to be self-sufficient. The idea is pretty simple, right? Basically, you take all of the existing tool sets that you have, whether it's SaaS applications, custom-built applications, services, databases, etc., and create a governance model that allows you to be componentized, right? I can define what team has access to what systems, what data, what actions, what users, but create kind of a layer that governs access to the existing applications and services. And then you take that model and then you hand it off to the business. Now, that business then needs a no-code platform that can consume that model, because otherwise they can't use it. Even if it's low code, they wouldn't be able to use it, right? So the low code kind of stays here. And they basically take that model, the components of that model, and then start to use it, pull it together into a marketing process or a sales process or a legal process or a finance process, or better yet, a legal plus sales process that allows these different pieces of your operations to actually work better together. And I think this is a concept that's very, very powerful. We see organizations moving more and more in this direction. And something that I think is positive and connected to all the other things that we're talking about that'll solve some of the challenges that we see in this space. Terri, any thoughts?
Yeah. And actually, I'm going to use James's question to kind of jump off on it. James had focused on the slide where you noted that BizOps feels a constraint because they don't have access to developers. And I think, again, if I go back to my 5T, I go, well, that's a talent issue. I don't have enough talent to be able to do what I want to do. I could answer that by getting more talent. And in this instance, it's actually an answer of a shift in talent. People do have to learn to apply technology to process. You're not going to be able to get away with that, right? That is something we all need to learn how to do. Mm-hmm. And sadly, we don't know how to do that very well. Folks who are kind of coming at this completely cold, if they do anything, they design very robotic work that, why would they want to do that to themselves is usually my question. So we do need to work on the skill set there, but through no code technology and training around good process for enabling technology operations in whatever your setting is, then I don't have to have more talent in the form of developers necessarily. I just need to have my talent that I have know a bit more. I need technology that is perhaps better suited to the talent that I have, and then those guardrails that enable people to apply technology in ways that get their work done.
Absolutely. Totally agreed. Great. So that leads us to the end of the webinar. We do have about 6 minutes for any additional questions. We have our contact, so we definitely look forward to having you reach out to us if you want to go deeper on anything. I'm also happy, by the way, I am a part of Tonkin, so if you want to see how Tonkin applies to some of these concepts, would be happy to share with everyone. I'm going to go in through the questions here and pick out a few. So there's one from Donald. Brett, were any of your survey findings surprising, or were they pretty much what you expected prior to receiving the results? So I think none of the results were, the opposite of what we thought, but we were surprised by the magnitude of some of the answers, right? So the fact that 95% of people are seeing in their organization that operations becoming more important, that was surprising, right? I think the surprising number of 95% of people were looking at no-code, low-code tools. That was surprising. How many people focused on change management as an issue was surprising, right? Because we always thought that was an issue, but we didn't realize people recognized it. So I think the biggest surprise in the survey was more along the lines of, the magnitude of how many people agreed with us versus something that we didn't expect. Any other questions from anyone?
Well, Brett, while we're waiting on someone to add another question, I just want to say I really liked how you described how the shift to work from home during COVID times really highlighted how much of our operations were being held together by kind of tacit, I think you said ethereal
osmosis,
things.
if you will.
Yeah, osmosis.
Yeah.
And I would say this is a fantastic opportunity to document where those things fell apart. I've been, no doubt everyone's been baking some sourdough bread. So I've been playing with dough more than I'd like to admit. But as you stretch dough, eventually, you get holes in it. And I think that's what COVID did for us, is it showed us where those holes were once we stretched everybody so far apart.
Yeah.
This is such an opportunity to document those holes and know we need to find systematic ways to fill them.
Yeah,
right.
absolutely.
Don't just let us find, they call it satisficing. What we're doing right now may just be something that's working. It's a stopgap measure. Maybe it's time to step back and really take that full 5T approach and figure out how can we do this in a way that's going to scale for the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think we got a question.
Yeah, so question from Jesse. Referring back to your IT and versus ops slide, IT and business operations are typically at odds. How do you get buy-in from both sides? Great question, because in many cases, the things that IT are looking to optimize for and the things that operations are looking to optimize for is in conflict with each other, right? You think about IT and you think, we want governance, standardization, security. You think walls a little bit. But on the other hand, ops needs agility. They need to move faster, right? And they're both valid. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to paint a negative picture for IT. It plays a very important role. And if you can add the empowerment part of it, it's even better. But I think in thinking about adoption of a no-code platform, that's why it's so important to think about what value does it add to both sides, right? Because if implemented correctly, you do get the acceleration while still maintaining the governance. And I think that is critical, is how do you map those two things together? So another question, do you think the push to no-code solutions have come from folks who are using the product, from leader CIOs? I think it is originating from the bottom-up movement, if you will. I think more and more business teams are looking at no-code solutions because they want to move faster. And so there is enticement there. But I think we're starting to see core IT teams and IT leaders wanting to standardize and allow this technology to be applied to multiple teams. So we do see that as well. All right. Last question, does Tonkin provide no-code software to your customers as part of your solution? Short answer is yes. And if anybody is curious to find out more specifically about Tonkin, feel free to reach out to me. We'll be reaching out to everyone as follow-up to this webinar as well. Great. So with that, I think we're at the end of the hour. I hope everyone that attended found it as enlightening as I did. It was great chatting and talking with you, Terri. I personally enjoyed it quite a bit. Thanks everyone for attending. Thanks, Terri, for joining, and have a great rest of the week.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks, everyone.